This is Railway Conversations with Doc Frank, and I'm Sean Connolly.
Hello and welcome back to the show. My guest today is again Sean Connolly from Malaga in Spain. Last week in episode 65, you heard the first part of our 2-hour conversation. If you missed that one, it's definitely recommended you go back to that. In today's episode 66, we have the second part of our conversation. We talk about the comparison of construction cost for high-speed rail projects around the world. We compare the relevance of European high-speed standards with what's happening on high-speed rail in, for example, Japan and China. We're talking about the importance of collaborating key stakeholders, the benefits of a shadow operator, whether Sydney Metro is a structural model for the delivery of high-speed rail in Australia, why partisan political support is critical for high-speed rail, and much more. Please enjoy this episode. This podcast is not sponsored by third parties, which means uninterrupted listening to the episodes for you, and I hope you appreciate and enjoy that. If you want to support the show to keep it going, there are 2 ways you can do it. One is the typical request for podcast, subscribe and share with your friends. The other one is specific to the show and myself. I host a training portal with arguably the world's most comprehensive course offer on digital signaling technologies and everything to do with high capacity. Some of my trainings are one of a kind, which means unique in the world. For example, the high-capacity signaling blueprint, the high-capacity railway mindset training, or most recently, my course about digital signaling interoperability. All of those courses are online, so you can watch the lessons at times convenient for you and as often as you like. And there is an industry-leading Q&A support where I will answer your questions, not just during your training, but at least for further 12 months after you completed your course. What you can do that would be really nice is checking out this training portal, which you find at docfranktraining.podia.com. That is docfranktraining.podia.com. And if you find that you or a coworker of you can benefit from any of those courses, I would be very happy to see you growing your knowledge, understanding, and confidence through any of my trainings. Thank you. But now, please do enjoy this episode. That's what used to be called design to cost, what you just mentioned, which seems to be missing a bit recently. So what I would think is probably a prudent idea is to have a formal peer review by someone who has done these kinds of requirements for high-speed lines before and have a track record of achieving design to cost activities that result in very favorable construction cost. You've done previous posts on LinkedIn where you compared the construction cost for high-speed line in Spain and in several other European countries.
Correct. Well, it was a very insightful report compiled and published by some of my collaborators and colleagues here, that analysed 86 high-speed rail lines, the construction cost. Because Spain and France and Europe does those things of design to cost quite well, or design to cost in accordance with passenger requirements, because a lot of the European countries do that quite well. Spain actually can do that for other reasons as well, including cost of labour, but Spain can actually do that at 17.7 million euros per kilometre. Spain can build high-speed railway over the course of analysing the last 10 high-speed line projects that Spain's built. In France, I think the number comes out at about 26.4 million euros per kilometre over the last 14 high-speed rail line, or the LGV lines that they built in France. our friends in the UK, for example, to go to the other extreme, gold-plated, over-engineered. Who knows what the original requirements were of HS2? That their number comes in at 167.5 million euros per kilometre. So, Spain can build high-speed rail in Spain for about a ninth of the cost of UK high-speed rail, and that's HS2 including HS1, and of course HS2 cost keeps rising. So who knows where that's going to end up? But there's the difference, if you like, that things that Spain and France and Germany and Italy do well with high-speed rail is matching the service and the design and the construction to the original demand. That the benefit of, if you like, the Spanish-French methodology and processes that they use versus out here what happened with HS2 in the UK. So there's plenty of lessons to be learnt there for Australia, who are just kicking this off in earnest again. If there was, as an Australian, if there was one thing, as an Australian and a rail professional, if there was one thing I would say, it would be, please learn from Spain and France and not from the UK. So in a way, I'm glad that we've got those examples at each end or at each extreme of the spectrum. We can say, well, let's not do that because that's what HS2 did, and look at the mess that ended up in. Or let's do this that France and Spain do and do very well. Yeah. So there's plenty of lessons to be learned, and I certainly hope and wish that that the people in charge are learning from the lessons of France and Spain and not from the UK.
Yeah, I wish I would have your conviction. I definitely share that notion that lessons learned should take the positive things where there were any, and also should take the negative things from elsewhere, but then with the only aim to avoid them for your own application. And generally telling Australians not to look at Great Britain for guidance. That's a hard one.
Wow.
Yeah,
I think we've had this before,
where we got people from the UK over here in Australia as the eminent authorities on high speed rail, being in charge of studies that were done here and so on. So I'm a bit suspicious here whether that would really work. But let's just see.
Well, like I say, the tender is out. The tender is out, and it's open internationally. So let's hope the Spanish and French and German engineering companies and rail advisories are onto that as much as the British will be, I'm sure. Of course, there's Australian branches of these engineering consultancies and advisories. DB have got branches in Australia. Arup, Ineco, AECOM. They've got branches in Australia, and I assume that they're all over these tenders to review and update the business case. I'm sure that the British firms will be as well. But I mean, if I'm on the evaluation panel for these things, it'd be one of my evaluation criteria. Well, have you built high speed rail before? What are your credentials? What was that end result for that? You've got to put case studies in. So if your case study is HS2, you're not getting high marks. It's as simple as that. Yeah. If
Well,
you
yeah,
if your case
you would think so. Yeah, let's see.
if your case study is Paris to Marseille or Paris to Lyon or Cologne to Frankfurt or Madrid to Barcelona, you simply must get scored higher than London to Birmingham.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably it should be that way. Let me circle back to something that we talked about quite a while ago, and that was your mention of European standards for high speed, where you basically say that high speed, both the tracks, the corridors, and also the rolling stocks are built in a similar way and in a interoperable way, if you wish, between Spain, France, Italy, Germany, and so on. And an important part when it comes to signaling is obviously the European Train Control System, ETCS.
Yep.
Now, I heard a recent podcast interview with Andy Byford, who is currently used to work in the UK quite a bit, here in Australia as well, but he's currently in the US working for Amtrak and is in charge of their high-speed rail endeavor, so to say. And he said that one of his big hopes is that a Japanese proposal for high speed based on the Shinkansen trains would be adoptable in the US. And I know for a fact that the Japanese have pushed for high speed here in Australia quite a bit as well. Both in saying, well, we have the longest high speed experience in the world, which is 60 years since the first Shinkansen entered service. And we may have a possibility to bring some finance along and so on and so forth. So
those things help. But let me tell you something about Japan. Japan do high speed rail very well. But they do Japan high speed rail very well for Japan. You got to remember that because of topology, terrain, earthquakes, etc., Japan builds high-speed rail. 94% of it is in tunnels or viaducts. Yeah, because they have to do that. Yeah, for, as I say, both terrain, very mountainous, and earthquakes. Yeah, the Shinkansen, very good train, 700 or the 700S, very good trains. But they're adapted to Japanese conditions. Now, again, Australia is not Japan. California to Vegas is not Japan either. There are different considerations in play. Like I say, if I'm building a high-speed railway in Japan, yep, great. I'm looking at a Shinkansen. Yeah. Does that translate to Australia or California? I don't necessarily think so. The terrain, the underlying conditions, certainly of I'm an Australian. What I know of Australia isn't comparable to anything that they've found in Japan, and we don't necessarily. Australia doesn't necessarily suit the Japanese style of high-speed rail and high-speed train. That's no knock whatsoever on the Shinkansen. Let me be clear on that. Yeah, the comparable routes for Australia are in Europe. Yeah, and knowing very little about what's going, apart from the fact that they're building it between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Again, I wouldn't necessarily think that the Japanese experience and the Japanese style is necessarily applicable to California to Las Vegas either. But I mean, that's somebody else's decision. I'm much more interested in Australia, and I think the comparable routes and the comparable conditions for Australian high-speed rail are much, much more like what is being experienced in the continent than what's going on in Japan. Japan is just way too different. Yeah.
What about China?
China, I don't know a great deal about what's going on in China. I'm sure China. I know China has topology and terrain, various different types. China builds high speed rail at about the same at about 40 or 42 million euros per kilometre. They've got enormous networks, but they're a communist country at the end of the day, and we need to remember that they also have different conditions. If Premier Xiaoling, or whatever his name is, says, I want a high-speed rail, it gets done. There's no great process. Yeah, I'm the boss. A bit like what happened in Mexico, but we won't go there. China's a communist country. Everything's controlled by the state. If he wants a high-speed rail, he gets it. Yeah, and it's done. Yeah, everybody runs along behind him, and there's not the level of scrutiny that there is in Europe, or I believe is in Australia, or might be in the US. But they make decent trains. Because they're a communist country, they do have political power. They've got money, and money always goes far. I mean, I saw a number as a part of that report that Europe competes a little bit there. The EU has contributed to 21% of the cost of Spain's lines, and elsewhere, France, Germany, Italy as well, although that's now reducing a lot. Europe are also involved in what's going on with the Baltics. They're funding a lot of that, yeah? But I mean, China are just so large, so cashed up, if you like, that you can see what China are doing in Africa, where they just go in with a big wad of money and build a railway and use it for political influence. I think anything involved in China is a bit touchy at the moment. I don't think politically the Australian government would be well advised to open up things like that to China. But who knows? If it's an international tender, the Chinese are probably welcome to compete. Yeah, I'd have reservations.
I just keep going through your prep documents, and one thing you mentioned there, which I think is really, really important, is the collaborative approach between the infrastructure owner, the operator of the high-speed services, and the entity that's responsible for the engineering, for the consultancy, and hence for the planning as well, which we discussed earlier is extremely important and really needs to be done right.
Yeah, this is really interesting. The situation here in Spain is that the infrastructure owner and manager is ADIF. Yeah, the engineering consultancy firm is Ineco, and the operator is Renfe. Yeah. Now, those three organizations are three arms of the same public service. Those three organizations are all government organizations, and they cooperate and collaborate very closely together under the Ministry of Transport, or under the Minister of Transport. Yeah, they basically treat each other like colleagues more than separate entities. Yeah, and they work together very, very well. And it's one of the good things about here in Spain. Yeah, is that when they're doing these initial studies and design activities, for example, Eneco knows who their client is. They know that their client is ADIF, yeah, and because they've got so much experience built up together, ADIF. Well, firstly, ADIF are their friends, yeah, workmates, teammates, whatever. Admittedly, the paycheck might get signed by a different arm of the public service or of the Minister for Transport, but they're colleagues, yeah, and they treat each other as colleagues and workmates, yeah. So Ineco, full of very clever people. Spain has a very highly educated workforce, especially in engineering and construction workforce, yeah. Ineco, firstly, they know that their customer is ADIF. They know 90% of ADIF's requirements up front because, firstly, a great proportion of ADIF's requirements are build me a high-speed rail to European standards. Double track, 1435 millimeter, ERTMS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And we want it to go from A to B. Yeah. So they work very closely together right from the first day. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Eneco also know that they're building this infrastructure for ADIF so that Renfe can run their trains over that infrastructure. They also know very, very well the operating characteristics of the Renfe fleet. Yeah, so they know who they're building the railway for. They know what they're building the railway for to run over. They've done studies before. They know the Spanish people, and it all works very well. And it's one of the advantages of certainly of Spain, and one of the reasons why they've been able to build the railway at the right level and keep the costs down is because they work very closely together. Now, obviously, once they built the railway, where in Europe, they will allow competition over that railway, but they're not building the railway for DB to run Siemens Renfe runs Siemens trains, but they're not building the railway for DB to run Hitachi trains over this infrastructure. No, they're very, very clear that their customers and colleagues are ADIF, Renfe, and under European standards. So that works very, very well, and they do cooperate and collaborate closely together, and they don't get into this situation where it is a confrontational problem. Yeah, they're huge projects. Problems always arise, issues always arise, but they sit down together in a room or with a beer in front of them, and they work it out together without arguing back and forth or having to go to lawyers or being confrontational. They treat each other as workmates and colleagues, and they sit down together and they sort it out. Yeah, and that keeps the cost down.
If I try to compare this with Australia, I can see it coming that the situation here would be very, very different. So we have only one national infrastructure owner here in Australia, and that's ARTC for the interstate network. They are currently struggling big time with the inland rail project.
Definitely.
So I would, and I'm probably not alone. I don't want to talk down on them, but I think I'm not the only one in Australia who would have severe doubts whether they are the right organization to be responsible for building a high-speed network or for owning a high-speed network going forward. So there's already a first gap which is missing. Compared to ADIF in Spain, which has a lot of experience of operating passenger rail networks in general, and also for many, many years now for high-speed networks. The next thing is the rail operator, the high-speed rolling stock operator. Again, we don't have a national one, which would be part of or an arm of the government or something like that. So that's probably something that would have to be created from scratch. And chances are, if I look most recently at Sydney Metro, that the operator would most likely be an experienced high-speed operating entity from abroad. Maybe a Renfe, maybe an SNCF, maybe a DB, or something like that. And with regards to consultancy, it's the same thing. We don't have anything like this sitting underneath the government. So Iñeco in Spain is a very different beast than what we have in Australia.
Well, yeah, let's take that back. Yeah, I think the Australian experience is probably much more competitive, and that's fine, and that's not a problem in itself. What Australia can learn from ADIF is that ADIF are a very strong end customer. Yeah. So whether it's the Australian high-speed rail or whoever it ends up being, the overall ultimate infrastructure owner and infrastructure or infrastructure manager, you need to be a strong customer. And again, we can say what we like about the Department of Transport and High Speed 2 in Britain. Again, we can learn some lessons from there. What Australia probably needs to do, and this happens elsewhere as well. I've actually been involved in it. For example, in Mexico, the infrastructure or the asset owner appoints a shadow operator, and I'm sure that will have to happen here in Australia. And the shadow operator advises the ultimate infrastructure owner very closely. Like I say, I've worked on the client side, advising the ultimate end owner and operator of the asset. This is what you need to be doing, or you need to be controlling that, right? This is how you organize procurement exercises for design, for construction, for rolling stock procurement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's something that does need to happen, and it's not necessarily a great problem for let's say, for the sake of the example, Australian High Speed Rail Authority to appoint a shadow operator that's going to help the ASHRA be a strong customer. Yeah? And I think that should happen. Then, of course, part of that is, of course, contracting and procurement. ADF, again, do that very well. They might do that a little bit differently than some other parts of the world, but because of their knowledge, they can pick and choose certain parts to contract out. They don't necessarily just contract it out as one great big lot. They might contract out parts. If they know that there are engineering companies that are better in building tunnels than others, they'll separate the tunnels out from the overall construction contract. They won't just issue the whole contract for the construction to one company. They'll say, well, here's lot A, lot B, lot C. Lot B is the tunnels. And they know that, let's say, SACA or Acciona are very good at tunnels. They'll probably win that because they've got the most experience. They'll come in with the best price. So Acciona build the tunnels, SACA might build the track or the stations, and ADF are very good at that as well, which, as I say, keeps the costs down, and it also spreads the overall risk out over. Because, I mean, if you've got one prime contractor building your railway and they muck it up, where do you go? Here in Spain, if Acciona muck up the track, well, the tunnels are still getting built, the stations are still getting built, and they just relet the track out to Ferrovial or somebody else. So ADF are very good at that, and that's contributed to them keeping the cost down. But that's being a good, strong customer, and I think that's a role where the shadow operator should certainly be assisting the ASHRA or whatever it's called as the ultimate infrastructure owner.
We have a model like this here in Sydney with Sydney Metro. I think they're doing exactly what you just mentioned. So they divide the project in several packages. One being the tunnels and stations, maybe not for the entire line, but for sections of the line. And then they have an overall systems package, which includes the trains as well, where you say, okay, well, this is really something that's not section by section. This is something that needs to be to fit the entire line. So you wouldn't have different signaling systems on different parts of the line. So that's just one system.
Logically. And again, this comes from from a knowledgeable shadow operator advises the infrastructure owner. Like I say, rolling stock and signalling, again, based upon advice from the infrastructure owner or the shadow operator of the infrastructure owner, gets let out to tender. The actual operation of the services, again, that goes out to tender. So your main authority, if you like, sitting on top, is not actually a network rail that has to actually do employ the maintenance and do the maintenance of the track. They just become largely a procurement operation that procures the various parts that are needed and then actively manages those contracts and stakeholders going forward. I'd say definitely with the strong advice and consultancy from a shadow operator to get it built. And like I say, I was a part of the shadow operator team on the Trend Marger, for example, where that was our job. Our job was to define operating models and rolling stock specifications, electrical subs. Where do we need electrical substations, and then to help the infrastructure owner split those up into lots, logical lots to then send out to tender. The infrastructure owner in Mexico is the army. They know. They don't know a great deal about the nitty-gritty, intricate details of railways. This point here or junction there, but they are very strong, very strong politically, and they do have enormous experience in procurement and contracting, and of course with the advice of a strong, knowledgeable shadow operator. And the help of the president, of course, that seemed to work well. But that's a model, if you like, that can be employed and work equally as well as, for example, the Spanish model. Yeah.
Talking of politics and political support, since you just mentioned that, that's a nice segue into the next question I wanted to ask you. You know that we have basically a two-party system in Australia. We actually have more than two parties, plus we have independents, but by and large, we've got two big parties, similar to the situation in the US or in the UK.
And Spain. Spain's the same. We have a left and a right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have a project like this, which will probably run over or will have to run over multiple decades in order to be built, how do you make sure that with a shift in political power, with a swap from one political party to the other in government, that we don't see a complete stop of the project, or the incoming government is the first thing is to scrutinize and then worst case abandon, cut the project and stuff like that.
We're talking the UK again, aren't we? This is exactly what happened in the UK with HS2. The Tories hate rail. It was approved and budgeted for under the previous Labor government in 2009. The Tories came in. The Tories hate rail. They did everything they could to sabotage it, and it killed the project. Now, I understand exactly what you're saying. Here in Spain, we have, much like Australia, a left and a right. Yeah. The good thing about Spain is that there has been bipartisan support for high-speed rail. Yeah. The left and the right, of course, they fight each other. But on high-speed rail, they don't, because I think they both understand the benefit of high-speed rail. The general public as well, are very positive on high-speed rail because it's been such a great success. And, of course, that snowballs. The more success you have, the more successful you'll be, and has a very good reputation and a very high level of confidence. We also have the EU here, and particularly in the earlier days, the EU was handing out money. So Spain was very keen to get their hands on EU contributions to build high-speed rail. Less so now, much less so now. But generally, that situation that I mentioned of ADIF, INECO, and Renfe being three arms of the public service, they work under a Minister for Transport. Yeah, the ultimate head of their department, they're the Transport Ministry and under a Minister for Transport. Various ministers for transport over the course of the past 20 years have been left or right, depending on the government in power at the time. But there's generally been bipartisan support across the political spectrum that HS high-speed rail is a good thing, and a good thing for Spain. and a good thing for the Spanish people. And so whilst they'll fight each other on other things, they've tended to leave the railways alone and basically let Adif, Renfe and Neco get on with it. Yeah. And that's been regardless of whether it's been left or right in power at the particular time. Because I think I think they generally do have an understanding that, some of these projects are start to finish long duration, 10, 12, 15 years from before you even see a train roll out of a station. So I think that's another good thing that's been here in Spain. And I think it's something else that's contributed to the success of high-speed rail here in Spain. And it's something that we must try and replicate to a certain degree in Australia, that there is bipartisan support across Liberal and Labor, with an understanding that it's a 40 or 45-year project for high-speed rail in Australia. And there must be this bipartisan support that whether it is us or them in power, it needs to have some sort of consistent trajectory. Now, ways that certain countries have done that is that they've devolved responsibility legally off to an arm of the government. For example, just for the sake of the example, let's say that's the ASHRA that become entirely responsible for the development, delivery, operation of high-speed rail in Australia, and who reports to the Minister of Transport, regardless of whether that Minister of Transport is a Labor or Liberal or whoever it may be at the time, but that it's generally the responsibility not of the Minister for Transport to have nice photo opportunities. His job is to make sure that checks and balances on the ASHRA are done, and that it's actually getting done. Obviously, the Minister of Transport is going to ask questions, but it's rather than the Minister of Transport being wholly responsible for the delivery of high-speed rail in Australia, it will have to be the entity that gets legally constituted to be responsible for the delivery of the overall project and the achievement of the benefits detailed in the business case.
Yeah, well, I think regardless, you certainly had a point that bipartisan support is absolutely critical for this, almost regardless of what the actual structure of the delivery authority is. And I think what that requires, and that's one of my biggest concerns there, is it requires for many politicians a change in mind shift to basically identify or define high speed as a topic which is not to be politicized. What I mean by this is that you see this very often in politics, that a certain topic, even though it makes a lot of sense for the public, is being shot down by the opposition just because it was a government proposal, or the government will shoot down a reasonable suggestion from the opposition just because it's from the opposition, and therefore it cannot be good by definition. I think high speed almost needs to be carved out in order for it to work. Where basically both political parties agree, well, we come to a joint conclusion. Does it make sense or not? And we will discuss and debate as long as we have something where both parties can reasonably say, well, yeah, I kind of believe in this. Yeah. Should we build a high-speed railway from between Melbourne and Sydney? That's almost a yes or no decision. And then basically agree to not use this
football.
Political, as a political football, exactly. Yeah, that's critical, I believe, but at the same time, relatively hard to achieve, because so many things, almost everything these days, is used as a political football in one form or the other.
It is very unfortunate. But as I say, Australia needs to find a way around that. And the Libs and Labor need to smash their heads together and jointly decide that, we're going to build high-speed rail. It's going to take us 40 or 45 years. Both of us are going to be in power at various stages over the course of that 45 years. And it requires some joint response for us to get it done in 45 years at this budgeted cost that we've come up with, that we say that we're going to do it for. And apart from that, we're going to put the heat on the delivery authority. Both of us can do that, whether we're Labor or Liberal, and we all move forward. The other thing I suppose I should probably mention here is that in the very unlikely event that either the left or the right here in Spain were to try to use high-speed rail as a political football, I think there'd be a huge backlash from the public. The public of the Spanish public very much not, there are pockets, of course. Not everybody's of the same opinion, but the Spanish, but because of the success that they've had, high-speed rail has a good reputation here in Spain, here in Europe. I think if either the government or the opposition were to start to even think about tinkering with high-speed rail, I think there'd be a huge backlash from the Spanish public.
Well, I guess the good thing about Spain is that you've already been down the learning curve or up the learning curve quite a bit. You do have a critical mass of high speed. The population by now is convinced of the benefits of high speed because they see it, they experience it in practice.
They use it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Australia is quite far away from that situation, and there are many skeptics here that typical quote like Australians love their cars and the high adoption of air travel. I mean, everybody complains about it, don't get me wrong, but at the same time they say, well, it's a necessary evil in order to be fast enough from one city into the other. Yeah, while at the same time they can still complain. And of course, air travel can be improved. Yeah, anything where you only have one or two companies sharing the market between them can be improved by nature.
And capacity is capacity. I mean, Kingsford Smith and Tullamarine are at capacity. You can't, even if they wanted to, they can't.
Yeah, but now they built Western Sydney Airport, which
Nancy
will
Bird,
open up additional capacity.
But that's still a long way away.
They also develop Avalon Airport in the southwest of Melbourne. I think with capacity, if airline really was the mode of choice, they can certainly come up with additional things. Yeah. And I mean, capacity is not just an issue for the air travel itself. It's also an issue for the services to and from the airport. And you may have heard that in Melbourne, the Melbourne Airport Rail project was just put on hold. But any capacity issues, well, you have the Skybus services. They just run a few more buses and then the problem is solved. Yeah, and I personally, even though I'm a railway fan, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be doing that podcast. but whenever I travel to and from Melbourne Airport, I thought the Skybus service was good enough. For me, it was fine to get from the airport into city centre.
Would you rather go from Southern Cross or catch the bus to if we're talking about high speed rail? Do you want to we talk about the overall journey time and this last mile stuff. Do you want to go city centre to city centre, or would you rather, or if it was available, or do you just take the bus because there isn't any other option or alternative?
Well, look, I can't really say how it is these days. I mean, I hear a lot of horror stories about these endless times for air travel end to end. I used to travel Sydney, Melbourne very, very frequently on a weekly basis, every week for more than a year, but it has been a while ago. Now, when I did this, what was possible for me was leave home early in the morning, get to the airport, fly from Sydney to Melbourne, have 6 solid hours of meetings in Melbourne, go back to the airport, fly back home to Sydney and arrive at the same night as a reasonable hour, like not midnight or so, but say being home at 9 o'clock at night or something like that. So with a normal day in the office the next day. If I had a train journey which takes 4 hours either direction, I would either have to cut in that scenario my meetings from 6 hours to 2 during the day, which means I'm not really productive in Melbourne, or I have to plan an overnighter in Melbourne, which of course has then consequences for my family life back at home. And I basically need a 2-day journey for what I would normally do in one day, and so on and so forth. So me personally, I would really think not just twice, but probably 3 times whether I want to swap over on the train if the purpose of going to Melbourne is to have meetings there, and not just sitting in a quiet room in a quiet
overall journey
train.
time comes into it. Yeah, this is where we talk.
Yeah,
Say
yeah.
high-speed rail must be competitive on overall journey time. Yeah. So if you could catch a 6 o'clock train out of Sydney that got you into the centre of Melbourne at 10 o'clock, and you could do your whole day, and you could catch the 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock departure out of Melbourne that gets you back home to the centre of Sydney at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the evening. It's the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Not quite, but hopefully close enough. Yeah. I have general doubts that with travel time or with travel speeds that you can achieve with a steel wheel on steel rail system is high enough over a distance like this to really match the journey times with air travel. I have principal doubts. And we had part of the live discussion recently, as you know, was that we discussed the possibility to look at different technology options which may give you faster travel times that are more comparable with air travel. So,
well, we've got these challenges. We've had these challenges here in Europe as well, and managed to overcome them. I've done some very initial analysis of the planned routes, and whilst, for example, Sydney through the Central Coast, through Newcastle, up towards Brisbane, the terrain and the topology is very difficult. We also need to think, if we're talking Sydney to Melbourne, that route, particularly between, let's say, the Canberra Junction down to Shepparton, is completely open. I mean, I'm sure you would be able to, for about 500 of those 824 kilometres, you would be able to floor it. Yeah. Like I say, more difficult as you go up the East Coast to Sydney to Brisbane, but certainly Sydney to Melbourne, I think you would be able to obtain high speeds for a large proportion of that distance. Because let's be honest, and I'll say this softly, there's not really very much between Sydney and the Gunning Junction that goes down. That's going to go down to Canberra. There's 520 kilometres there, and it just goes through, outback Australia, basically. Yeah, with a couple of towns in between. Yeah.
Since you just mentioned Sydney to Newcastle, so that seems to be one of the decisions that are apparently cast in stone.
Yeah, very strange.
The high-speed rail authority from day one said, and our primary focus to start with will be Sydney to Newcastle. And there's already first criticism coming up why it has to be this connection, whether it would make more sense to have, say, Sydney-Canberra as a starting point. And what I noted in your prep paper was, and you just said it again, that the topography between Sydney and Newcastle is one of the most difficult ones for high speed on the entire connection, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. So do you consider this a good thing to start with the most difficult stretch, or do you think that's rather an undue risk?
I don't know enough, and I'm not an engineer. Let me preface my comments by that. I'm not an engineer, but I've had a look at the topology, and I understand how difficult it's going to be to get a high-speed rail line, particularly from Sydney to the Central Coast. let's say Wyong, yeah? Very, very difficult. And even in the original 2013 report, they recognised that, and they said that it would require a lot of tunnels and viaducts. As if you look at the roads that go through there, the roads need viaducts. So never mind cars, they're going to have tunnels and viaducts to go up from Sydney to Wyong. I don't know why they chose Sydney to Newcastle as the first, given that it's probably going to be the most expensive section. It's 134 kilometres. That's going to cost something like 141 million Australian dollars per kilometre to build. Yeah,
per kilometre. Okay,
it's going to cost. That Sydney to Newcastle leg is about a 19 billion Australian dollars cost. Yeah, which is as much as some of the other legs, much longer. Yeah. I'm going to take a few guesses, and let me say they are guesses. We need to remember that in the original instance, who was Australia's Minister for Transport in 2013? I know. Albanese.
Was Albanese? Yeah, I was guessing that. I wasn't exactly sure when he was transport minister, but it was roughly that time.
He was the one. He was the one that commissioned the original 2013 report. He's always been, my knowledge of him, he's always been a big favourite of public transport and particularly rail. I'm not going to cast aspersions there, but he's now the Prime Minister of the country. There is very pressing issues for residentially and particularly land crisis around Sydney that's got a lot of people are now moving to that out of Sydney and onto the Central Coast. It's got probably because of the topology, but it's got a very old, very, very slow commuter service railway. It takes about 2 hours 30, 2 hours 40, winds its way around the mountains, all sorts of stuff. Yeah. There are advantages in land use. Yeah. And of course, land use forms part of your business case. If they can have a high-speed railway along that New South Wales Central Coast, it basically makes the Central Coast into a suburb of Sydney. 82 kilometres, for example, from Wyong to Sydney, which is beautiful country. Yeah, water, mountains, greenery, really nice place to live. But I mean, if at the moment it takes them, some enormous amount of time, up to 2.5 hours to get in and out. So it's not practical for them to commute to work. If they can get that down to something like 30 minutes with it being on the high-speed rail line, even at 160 kilometres an hour, having to go through tunnels and viaducts, a 30-minute commute into Sydney makes Wyong basically a suburb of Sydney, and you can start to do certain things with land use and land value. They talk about land capture and capture value, but it's almost, and I hope this is not the case, it's almost like they want the Sydney to Central Coast to be Sydney Metro North, for example. And that's not the purpose, yeah? That's certainly not the purpose, because, I mean, if they want Sydney Metro North between Sydney and Wyong, that's a different railway. But, I mean, I hope that is, they've seen South and City, they've seen Northwest Rail Link, they've seen the Western Sydney Airport Link, all of the Sydney Metro, all the good things that's done. I hope that they are not thinking that they can turn the Sydney Central Coast leg of the high-speed railway into Sydney Metro North, because we can't be starting high-speed trains every 5-10 kilometers to pick up and drop off. Yeah.
I think that will be a key point where the stations, how many stations there will be on that connection, how many stations in between Sydney and Newcastle, and where those stations will be. I think that will tell quite a bit of a story, what they really want to achieve with that line.
I've done a study of that, like I say, specifically because it was the first chosen, and specifically for that reason. I'd suggest that they could maybe stop at Gosforth, which is the largest city on the central coast, and maybe Wyong. Yeah, I might even run it. As a separate service over the high-speed rail infrastructure with a different fleet, different set of trains. This might be to match the service to the infrastructure. For example, we talk really high speed. If we're talking Siemens, if we talk really high speed rail, Sydney to Melbourne, we might want Velaros, but for to run up and back between Sydney and Newcastle over the very same infrastructure, we might get away with the Ice 4 trains, for example. Yeah, and just stopping no more than Gosford and Wyong. The catchment area expands out to the whole of the central north coast. If you have to drive 10 kilometres from somewhere into Gosforth Park and Ride, or from 10, 15 kilometres around from Wyong into the Wyong Park and Ride, get on the high-speed train and you're in Sydney 30 minutes later, that could work for me. Yeah, but I'd do it with different trains, just using the high-speed rail infrastructure. And then, of course, that presents me an operational problem that I need to interleave and not conflict with the really high-speed Sydney Melbourne train. But I can do that. I can do that. It makes it a bit difficult, but I could do that. Yeah.
You need overtaking, almost like overtaking lanes for trains.
No, you'd interleave them. You'd interleave them. Yeah.
Yeah, but that will have consequences on your timetable, as you probably know. Yeah, but would you consider any suburban stops in Sydney on the way into Central?
There is talk about this. There is talk of having apart from Sydney Central, that there is the potential to have a Sydney North, maybe Chatswood, and a Sydney South stop of the high-speed rail. Again, if the demand demands it, you can do it. They're already talking about having to build 67 kilometres of tunnels for entry and exit of Sydney, around Sydney, as a part of the high-speed rail project. Yeah, I do know, as a comparison example, the main city station in Madrid is Atocha. Yeah, they've just very recently finished the additional works and building and opening Chamartin. So now you can catch the Spanish high-speed trains and get off in Atocha or Chamartin in the centre of Madrid. And depending on where your office is, one or the other may be more convenient. Yeah. So, I mean, that's an option. And again, it's something that I say needs to be analysed, needs to be costed, and needs to be balanced out to, is the demand high enough to justify a Sydney South or a Sydney North stop as well? Yeah.
Okay, we used up our time. Sean, thank you very much for your interesting insights into high-speed rail. I think we are up for very interesting times in Australia without anybody being able to say how economically sensible it will be and whether or not it will be built. But I think one of the takeaways is certainly that Spain is one of the countries to look at when it comes to building affordable high-speed rail services.
Yep, definitely. So thanks
Thanks
very
very
much.
much.
Thanks very much for your time, and thanks for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Bye, bye, Sean. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.